I'm late identified autistic, published writer, autistic advocate and educational consultant. I worked previously for 20 years as a teacher in early years and SEND settings, and my personal website is Autistic Realms. I've got 2 neurodivergent children and lived experience of supporting people with PANDAS. I'm not a medical professional, so I'm very much here talking through my lived experience of supporting people in our community. I'm deeply invested in promoting neuroaffirming work rooted in the neurodiversity paradigm and human rights movement. So yeah, many thanks to PANDAS charity for inviting us to talk today, and also for the opportunity to contribute towards the new webpage about PANDAS and neurodivergence. So we hope this is going to be really helpful for parents, carers and any other professionals that may be supporting our young people today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Hard to follow you with all the wonderful things that you do. And I'd like to also second the thank you for the invitation from PANS and PANDAS UK to be here today. I've been interested in PANS PANDAS for many years, and it's just been something that I've realized I really want to help create more and more support in, and for the community people that I work with. As mentioned, I work in what nurses and other healthcare workers tend to call the ADLs, or activities of daily living, those things that just seem to come up every single day, and that's that food and eating, toileting, sleep, hygiene. And so that's the areas where I tend to see young people, or the parents of young people, who need some help if they've been diagnosed or considering PANS and PANDAS. I'm late identified autistic PDA and ADHD, and I got a couple kiddos. So a lot of my work has been inspired by figuring out, how do I take care of myself and how do I take care of my kiddos? So again, thank you so much for having us here today. We have a few aims with our webinar today. Our aims are threefold. First, we would like to explain what PANS and PANDAS are and how they present. The second thing is to look at the overlaps with neurodivergence, particularly autism and ADHD, and why these overlaps can make recognition more difficult of PANS and PANDAS. The third is we want to start looking at practical strategies, resources, and tools that can support you, the families, and also schools and other professionals. We'll also be introducing 3 information gathering templates that we've developed to help do this, to help you families and professionals log patterns, spot changes, and communicate more effectively with education and healthcare teams. These will eventually sit alongside this recording on the PANS PANDAS UK webpage, along with the recording of this webinar. But if you're interested in checking them out now, I put them up today in the blog section of my website and also on my Substack. So that way, if you were interested in looking at these templates, those are already there. We'll make sure that you get that link. In addition, there is a collection of infographics on slides 6, 7, and 10 that we'll be sharing during this presentation. And these were created collaboratively with us by a professional working group of neurodivergent educators, all of us working really to shine a light on this intersection of PANS, PANDAS, and neurodivergence, as it's often an overlooked area of care, and we're very grateful for their support. So a shout out and a thank you to Dr. Joanne Riordan, Viv Dawes, Julie Webb, Ben Palmer, and of course the PANS PANDAS UK charity.
Thank you very, very much. So, as Laura and I are both autistic advocates, as we've said. So we're rooting this presentation within the framework of the neurodiversity paradigm, and we believe it's really important to step back a little bit and recognise, firstly, that society as a whole is neurodiverse. So we're going to look a little bit about what actually is neurodivergence to start with. And when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about what the scholar 𝘗𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬 form of human diversity. The idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind or one right style of neurocognitive functioning is a culturally constructed kind of phenomenon. And so when we're using the term neurodivergent, we mean having a mind that functions in ways which diverge significantly from dominant societal standards of what is classed as being normal. And this is a huge umbrella term. The umbrella for neurodivergence is vast. We've just listed a few things here, and it can include many innate differences that people may be born with, for example, like being autistic, ADHD, PDA, which is pathological demand avoidance or persistent drive for autonomy, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and there's many, 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 many more. And a person whose neurocognitive functioning diverges from society's norms can happen in multiple ways. So people can be autistic and also dyslexic, PDA, and that is often described as being multiply neurodivergent. So those are just some of the, just kind of wanted to address that and some of the terms that we'll be using. So it's also important to know that neurodivergence can also be acquired through life experiences such as brain injury and trauma, because these are events that can change the way a person thinks and responds longer term, making them literally diverge, change neurologically from those expected and socially accepted ways of being. If you're neurodivergent, you're not ill, you don't have something wrong with you that requires fixing. And for many of us, like myself and Laura believe, being neurodivergent is a source of pride and it's an important part of our identity. It's a really valid and meaningful way of being in the world. And we believe that the challenges that many neurodivergent people face often arise not from our neurology itself, but it's from those unmet needs in our environment, systemic injustices within society, that often just give priority to those neurotypical, neuronormative ways of being, that often overlook, dismiss, or sometimes even stigmatise neurodivergent people's authentic needs. Whereas PANDAS, on the other hand, are medical neuropsychiatric conditions that we're talking about today that really require that early identification and access to supportive treatment. Either PANS or PANDAS can co-occur alongside other health and medical issues and also alongside different types of neurodivergence. So just to clarify that, you can be both neurodivergent and have PANS or PANDAS. So you could be autistic with PANS and PANDAS as well. And likewise, you may have PANS, PANDAS and not be autistic or neurodivergent in any other way. But for many people, and what this presentation is going to be concentrating on, is how PANS, PANDAS may look for our autistic and neurodivergent children and the overlaps. PANS, PANDAS symptoms may come and go more obviously in response to infections, whereas if your child's autistic or neurodivergent, some of those similar traits may be just present within their everyday life, and we're going to be exploring that in a little bit more depth and how their spiky profiles will possibly change. So we're really encouraging people through this presentation just to stay curious, have an open mind, and that way our families can get the right support whilst respecting and meeting their child's authentic neurodivergent needs. So we're going to move on now onto our next slide, which is going to looking at our neurodivergent spiky profiles in a little bit more depth. And we're going to be drawing back onto this idea of the spiky profile throughout the presentation, because we think it provides hopefully a good foundation stone for people to develop their understanding a little bit deeper, to help understand the overlap. So autistic people often have what are called spiky profiles, as demonstrated here. It can affect all different areas of their life and ways of being. And these uneven patterns of strength and challenges across different areas of a person's life means that they may not be consistently high or low in ability in different areas, and that things are going to be fluctuating. So communication, gross and fine motor skills, and just the general day-to-day ways that people are able to function and manage is going to change. The spiky profiles show how autistic and neurodivergent can have very uneven strengths and challenges. So for example, some might be really good at maths or creative projects, but they might really struggle with everyday planning, organising, personal care, washing, showering, organising their school bag, even though they might be studying astrophysics. And it also means that sometimes neurodivergent people are able to deeply focus on an area of interest, but they might find things like multitasking in class, group work, switching between tasks in the day, really difficult. And having these spiky fluctuating sensory processing differences can impact everything even further and affect executive functioning, attention, memory, perception, cognition, and just the ability to generally be able to learn and thrive unless needs are being met in an understanding, safe environment. A couple of hours ago, I joined Dr. 𝘗𝘰𝘵𝘦𝘢𝘗𝑆 webinar at the conference, and they mentioned about sensory regulation, and I just wanted to kind of pull that in here a little bit more, because when we're recognising those fluctuations of when our autistic or neurodivergent people are dysregulated, it's going to affect their ability to be able to function. Dr. Joanne talked about the stress response being related to the sympathetic nervous system, which is when our children go into that fight or flight kind of mode, which prepares us for stressful and dangerous situations. And I think it's just worth having a little think about the overlaps of the spiky profiles and how people's stress responses may change. And this is kind of further developed in Naomi Fisher's webinar earlier on this week as well, when she looked at trauma responses. So it's worth having a look at those webinars. And so for children with PANDAS, these spiky profiles are likely to become spikier in many ways. Their difficulties may be even more intense at times, especially during a PANDAS flare-up. It might look like your child is regressing. They might kind of be returning to some ways of being or behaviours that you thought they might have grown out of. And they might be in that survival mode that Dr. John Wilden talked about, in freeze, fight or flight mode. So all their energy is being redirected into like a survival state, basically, just trying to function as best they can, which leaves less energy for all other areas of their life, such as communication and everything else, and fine and gross motor skills, eating, dressing, everything. So I think hopefully recognising that spiky profiles exist as a starting point could be helpful and help us focus on the real variable and kind of fluid mix of strength and support needs that each individual may have. So things aren't just put down to them struggling just because they're autistic. And we're going to loop back to this a little bit later in the presentation. And for now, Laura's going to go on and just explain a little bit about PANDAS and how it all, and then we'll move on to how it all relates.
Thank you so much, Helen. I feel like I could listen to you all day, and I was having to remind myself that I'm also presenting, but I'm learning as we go. It's great. So yes, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the difference between PANS and PANDAS. Okay, so where things get a little more complicated, and I even saw this come up in the chat just now, is when medical conditions such as PANS or PANDAS overlap with neurodivergence. That's where confusion happens, delays, and misunderstandings often arise. So again, we've said this before, both neurodivergence and PANS and PANDAS can involve challenges such as anxiety, the sensory sensitivities that were just brought up, sleep difficulties, psychosis, so a state where someone experiences a loss of contact with reality, making it difficult to distinguish between what is real and what isn't, significant changes in eating or difficulties with attention and memory. This overlap can sometimes make it hard to recognize when something new is happening, particularly if professionals assume that all difficulties are simply because of autism or because of ADHD. So that assumption is known as diagnostic overshadowing. It's when new or acute symptoms are mistakenly attributed to an existing neurodivergence. This overshadowing, it's really important because this means that children or young people don't get the medical support that they urgently need. So again, why this distinction really matters. Key points: PANS and PANDAS are medical conditions, often with a sudden onset, usually after an illness that can intensify neurodivergent traits. And again, just like Helen said earlier, the distinction really matters because misattributing PANS and PANDAS symptoms simply to being neurodivergent excludes this person from getting that care. Okay, and then PANS and PANDAS, why are they often grouped together? Mainly because of sharing symptoms. Both can, again, begin quite suddenly, and symptoms may come and go over time, which is often referred to as a flare, with symptoms relapsing and remitting. What is PANS? So clinical diagnosis. Major symptoms often include things like OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder and restricted eating or severely restricted food intake. To be diagnosed with PANS, a person only needs one of these major symptoms, plus at least two other symptoms recognized on the PANDAS symptom list, which you can find on the charity's website if you'd like to look further. Symptoms usually develop suddenly, typically within 1 to 2 days after illness, and very severely. Again, the symptoms often follow that relapsing, remitting course, meaning symptoms improve and then can get worse again over time. Common triggers for PANS includes infections, and then there's a lot more research coming out about what are some of the other triggers, and these can be environmental factors, immune or inflammatory conditions, and metabolic conditions are being explored as well. And then looking at what is PANDAS, again, a clinical diagnosis with the major symptoms being OCD again, or obsessive compulsive disorder, and tics. So those are brief, often brief involuntary body movements or sounds, such as eye blinking or throat clearing, that a person may find hard to stop even if they want to. So to be diagnosed with PANDAS, a person needs at least one of those major symptoms alongside others from that symptom list. As with PANS, the onset is often within that 1 to 2 day window, and severe, with symptoms again relapsing and remitting. So the key difference here, though, is with PANDAS is that it follows the group A streptococcal infection, often known as strep. So these infections cause common illnesses like strep throat, scarlet fever, tonsillitis, impetigo, which is a more surface skin infection, and then cellulitis, which is a deeper skin or soft tissue infection, and in rare cases, pneumonia as well. So important to remember that children with PANS or PANDAS may show different combinations of symptoms, and these can change over time. A diagnosis does not require every symptom to be present. And again, to learn more about what that symptom list, the PANS PANDAS UK webpage has some great resources for you. I'll pass it back over to you, Helen.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, so as I said earlier, you may have just been listening to Laura there and thinking, gosh, so that sounds exactly like my autistic child, and I don't even know if they've got PANDAS. It may all feel really, really familiar to you, and feel like, well, that's just who my child is, that you're describing being autistic. And that can be really, really, really confusing for parents and also for professionals. It can leave you wondering, is my child actually autistic, or do they have PANS instead, or could it be both? And it's very difficult to untangle this, but the answer is yeah, they can sometimes co-occur, and as we said, you can be neurodivergent and also acquire PANS. And likewise, a child with PANS may not be innately neurodivergent. But some children often end up down that autism pathway because of this overlap of presentations, which is why seeking out professionals that really understand autism and neurodivergence and PANDAS in a neuroaffirming way is really, really, really important to seek out. And we know that when neurodivergent children are in distress, our concerns as parents and carers can often be dismissed, especially if they're autistic, because the presentations can look so similar. But it's, as parents and carers, we know our children best. You know instinctively what your child's usual patterns and behaviours are, and you maybe just get that feeling, you notice when something changes and just isn't right. You know their natural baseline, you know what their natural spiky profile may look like, what they find easier and harder. And it's when those spikes become bigger and when those changes keep happening time after time, possibly following things like illnesses, that's when we need to kind of be concerned, and be curious as to what could be causing that distress. And it might be PANDAS. It could be other problems at school, which is kind of causing that that stress response, or it could be other medical or social factors. Dr. Luke Bearden, we've got one of his famous quotes here. He's called a golden equation. I put it in a slight golden box there. So Dr. Luke Bearden is a researcher at Sheffield Hallam University who's done loads of fabulous work about supporting autistic children. And their work is based around how important the environment is for autistic people to be able to manage and cope, and to be able to thrive or not. Their golden equation is autism plus environment equals outcomes, which basically means that when the environment is right and when autistic people feel safe, then we can flourish and do really, really well. But when autistic people's needs aren't being met, then it can sometimes look like they're becoming more autistic, which isn't an actual thing. You can't become more autistic, but you can have an autistic trauma response, and those traits can be magnified. And if a child has also got PANDAS, then those symptoms are likely to be intensified as well. And this autistic trauma response to being in an environment that isn't meeting our needs, often builds up over time. as Naomi Fisher's presentation talked about, based on understanding trauma a little bit more. So trauma responses happen when needs aren't being met or something has happened over time. Children may experience increased anxiety, more difficulties with their communication, their sensory system may be further heightened and dysregulated, and that's going to affect everything from sleep to eating, possibly toileting, possibly an increase in tics, possibly OCD for some people, the ability to socialise, the ability to engage in school and learning. It's going to affect all different areas of their lives, and that's going to look different for different people as well. And so, yeah, what we're kind of trying to highlight is that those autistic trauma responses to life can look very, very similar to PANDAS symptoms. An autistic trauma usually builds up really slowly over time from being in those overwhelming environments. Generally, where children are expected to mask, and the neurotypical behaviours such as sitting well in class, making eye contact when spoken to, doing work and communicating in neurotypical ways are rewarded in schools through, behaviours like charts and star charts. And all of that can really impact autistic children's ability to thrive. And if they're constantly masking and having to adapt to try and fit into their environments, then over time that's going to lead to greater difficulties in areas of their life, and possibly other mental health difficulties and autistic burnout, which is what we're going to be coming onto a little bit later. So we're going to move on to the next slide, which is overlapping traits and differences. And this is just a summary slide, really, of some of the neurodivergent traits, and especially those autistic trauma responses we've just been talking about, and how similar they can look to PANDAS. And that's why we need to be looking at your child's natural baseline and their own natural, unique, spiky profile, and what's actually normal for them. And when we notice changes, we need to be staying curious about what's going on and not comparing our neurodivergent children to neurotypical children. It's about understanding their own patterns and not somebody else's, and honouring their authentic autistic or neurodivergent identity. So the next slide we're moving on to is about myths. And Laura and I are deeply in the autistic kind of community, spending much of our lives talking to families whose children are often really struggling, especially in school settings, and they're trying to advocate for their children. And we're often told that, they need to learn to fit into the school system, they need to learn to get on with it. We're doing everything we can in school, there's nothing much more we can do, and they need to fit in to our way of doing it, when it's generally the opposite to what our children need. They need to be in safe environments so they can be themselves, and it's the environment that needs to change to fit their needs. And so many of our children's struggles are often put down to them. Oh, well, it's because they're autistic. They're bound to be, things are bound to be hard for your family. They're bound to be difficult. All autistic children, most autistic children struggle. And people are trying to find ways to support them. But when we're suspecting that our children may also have PANDAS, some of those concerns, when you're saying, well, actually, their spiky profiles are getting even spikier, that they're really struggling now, and it may have happened quite suddenly, and you just don't maybe recognise who your child is now, that baseline has completely changed for your children. And yeah, we know that a lot of those concerns are often dismissed, or at very worst, parents are blamed. And as Laura's mentioned, that diagnostic overshadowing is a really prevalent in our community. And Kelly Jarvis, who's also presented at the PANDAS webinar, has done a presentation about this, and fabricated an induced illness. So if that's something you're experiencing or struggling with at the moment, I'd recommend you have a little look and check that out. But in reality, as we said, many of the challenges our children are facing, autistic children are facing, are due from those environments that don't fit them, like the noisy classrooms and constantly transitioning through the days with not enough time for their special interests, and feeling that pressure to always mask and not enough time to regulate. And that those times, all of these difficulties can be exacerbated, intensified if they're also experiencing PANDAS as well, and that can lead to burnout and mental health difficulties. So the next slide, we know we're covering a lot here, and some of these concepts, and even possibly the terminology we're using, might be quite new to a lot of people, and we're really aware of that. So hopefully you'll be able to re-listen to this presentation or dive into some of the resources that we're suggesting at the end to look a little bit deeper if this is striking a chord or you're interested. But just to cover briefly, we've discussed what it means to be neurodivergent. We've covered what PANDAS is and how some of those symptoms may present for some people. And we've looked at autistic trauma responses, and how these are the result of unmet needs in the environment, not just because a child is neurodivergent. And yet, as a parent myself, I know it can feel like you're trying to navigate a maze almost blindfolded, especially when your child is already distressed and you've got pressures of work and everything else going on, other siblings and relationships. And it can be really, really, really difficult. But regardless of whether your child is autistic or not, or they're neurodivergent or not, whether they've got PANDAS or not, if your child is struggling, it's important to step back and think, what is the root causes of that, and how can we best support them, regardless of any labels, and the journey towards getting those diagnoses as needed. So before we move on any further, we're going to add a new layer into what is already quite a complex conversation that we're having here. And we're going to be talking about autistic burnout on the next slide. So as we've mentioned, many of the traits that are used to identify autistic people are often trauma responses to living in a world that basically isn't designed for us as autistic people. And if our needs aren't being met, those trauma responses, as we've said, can sometimes look like a person is becoming more autistic, which isn't an actual thing. It's just that they're struggling more, and those trauma responses are getting stronger. And these heightened states of distress and the difficulties with coping can all contribute and potentially lead to burnout. And this burnout for our autistic and neurodivergent children can be even more acute if they're also struggling with PANDAS. And it's adding a whole new layer for them to try and navigate and manage their lives and just get through every day. So what is autistic burnout? This is one of my own special interests. There's a load of stuff on my website about autistic burnout if you want to have a look at it, and I'll drop a link in a few minutes. So autistic burnout has been described as a debilitating syndrome preceded by an overload of life stressors and the daily challenge of existing in a neurotypical world. It's frequently misdiagnosed as possibly depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or many other conditions. And that research comes from Arnold et al. In 2023. And again from Arnold's research and the Aspire project from 2006, they list a wide range of experiences of autistic burnout. And as you can see from the slides we developed in our community working group, this list looks really, really, really similar to that of a child with PANDAS and how they may present. So it includes things like a loss of skills, difficulties with cognition, executive functioning, memory, speech, communication, daily living, sensory changes, increased sensitivity to sensory input, environmental overwhelm, a reduced tolerance for change, behavioural and emotional changes, more frequent meltdowns and shutdowns, increased need for stimming, increased need for sameness, heightened distress, and general emotional overwhelm. It can cause physical and mental exhaustion, chronic fatigue, social withdrawal, and a worsening of physical and other mental health conditions. And in addition, it affects people's ability to function, difficulties with work, school, planning, memory, self-care, maintaining their own routines and hygiene, and a general reduced enjoyment of activities they once found pleasurable or were able to take part in. So burnout is usually linked to a long-term imbalance between the demands and available resources a person has, such as sensory overload, masking, and lack of accommodations can all add to this. Burnout usually develops gradually over time. You may see more signs of those after-school meltdowns or shutdowns. You may see little signs of your children really beginning to struggle and join in activities or play sessions with their friends that they once used to be able to manage. The overlap and the key differentiation between autistic burnout and PANDAS is that PANDAS, as we've said, is, it's an immune-triggered acute neuropsychiatric syndrome, and it often comes on quite suddenly after an illness, whereas neurodivergent autistic burnout is a result of chronic stress and a demand resource imbalance, and it can improve over time with more rest, lower demands, and more support and understanding. And if we misinterpret one as the other or don't consider how they may overlap, then our children are risking not getting the support and the care that they really need and deserve. So I'm going to do this long monologue. I'm sorry. I'm going to move over to Laura now for the next slide. Thank you, Laura.
Oh, you're very welcome, but you know this so well, so it's great to hear you, and we really appreciate you sharing. Before I say the next slide, I just want to address, we've been saying that the onset tends to be quick, fairly short after an illness, mainly because we've been trying to make sure that this webinar, because we took it so seriously of like the weight of knowing that this is such an important topic and very, very nuanced. We kept it to where we could find the evidence. We know the agreed evidence. We weren't able to find where it's the longer onsets. And so that's why we didn't include it. And we thought, are we just going to lead people or say something that's not correct? When we hear that from families routinely as well. So thank you for in the chat. I just wanted to acknowledge that we were trying to keep it as evidence-based as possible to make sure we took our job as seriously as possible, but we agree with you. And I think that is just this other really big layer when it's not right away. You're like, well, yeah, but it was like a year ago they got sick. But the body is a complicated being. So you might be seeing, as some of you are in the chat, that sometimes it can be a later onset. So thank you for bringing it up. We're hoping
Yeah,
that one of the
before
years
we
of
go on from that, Laura, so I think I did add it into our presentation as well, I think, but it's possibly a Q&A question, but we can add it in here spontaneously. Things like the interoception system, I think, is really important to consider for our autistic and neurodivergent children, which is your internal system, which recognizes maybe when you're hungry or tired or need the toilet or you're in pain. And many autistic people struggle understanding their interoceptive system and their signals, and that can sometimes cause a delay for many autistic children, or an unawareness even that they're hungry or they're tired, and it can cause lots of difficulties. But as Laura said, we haven't found medical evidence-based research relating this to PANDAS, so we haven't drawn on or commented on it too deeply here, but it's definitely something to consider for autistic and neurodivergent children in general.
Maybe by the next PANDAS conference, we'll have more, right?
So we've diverged. We've got loads to cover.
So much work. All right. So going back to the slides. So thank you, everyone, so much. Going back to the slides. This slide is mainly as a summary of Helen's discussion, because Helen brought up an immense amount of really layered, important, detailed information. And again, we know this is a short amount of time. We're having to say quite a lot, but we know that you'll get the slides and the recording. So hopefully you'll be able to go back, and some of these things were already said, or it's what's being said in the next upcoming slides. So that way you can kind of sit with it and, make a cup of tea and read through it at your own leisure. All right. And I think this is me again. So I'd like to share a little bit of from a family that I know that I've worked with for now a few years, and it's with their permission. And every PANDAS case can look different because everybody is different. Everyone's their own person. This one centered a bit more around toileting, because that's where I first met the parent at a workshop around toileting. But of course, for other people, they're the first kind of flags of maybe we need to investigate could be around OCD or tics or emetophobia, the fear of sickness, or again, psychosis. So what ended up happening is I was hosting a workshop around toileting. I focused more on older kiddos, preteens and teens. And this this parent was representing their 6-year-old daughter and had mentioned, my daughter was, as quoted by the parent, fully toilet trained at 3, and at 6 they just stopped. Things became very, very difficult. Lots of changes happened, and her daughter returned to using pull-ups and required full assistance with toileting. She also reported for her daughter experiencing extreme emotional lability, so really big ups and downs. Eating had greatly changed. She had greatly reduced the number of foods that she was able to access. And she mentioned that she no longer seemed interested in her peers or really engaging with other people, and didn't really initiate leaving the house anymore. This was in addition to sleep pattern changes. So went from a very routine bedtime to staying up very, very late, lots and frequent wakes in the night, and really extreme anxiety. The mom at this point, she said to me that at this point she has raised her concerns with the GP many, many, many times, because she just feels like something is going on. But again, unfortunately, the GP kept saying, this is because of your daughter's autism. This is all down to your daughter's autism. And this mom repeatedly would say, something else is going on. It's not just that. I believed her to be autistic, but something else is going on. I stayed in touch with her for quite a long time, just as a support, because I don't do diagnosing with PANDAS, but just trying to help her build out the information that she could put together to provide healthcare providers to help figure out like where to start, what to go on, because it can be incredibly overwhelming. She ended up realizing her daughter had strep, and scarlet fever at that age 6, right around the time of her birthday, and didn't realize there was that connection. So we discussed that as, maybe on the list of things to consider, and had discussed what PANDAS is. And this also was on my mind because something medical was just kind of on my mind because attempts for reteaching skills in flares is very difficult. That's a common pattern. So this young person, again, had been using the toilet. It's finding it really challenging at this point. And then despite the mom putting in lots and lots of supports around toileting, really couldn't make any progress with that. So together also put together some things for their school, including removing reward charts that were implemented for toileting and emotional regulation, really helping the school understand that like this kiddo is doing the best that they can. It's not a behavioral issue. They need a lot of support and real curiosity, that word curiosity, from their medical team. And that was real big piece too, was that this young person needs medical evaluation to go through a whole list of potential things, including PANDAS, and helping the staff, the education staff, to understand even just what that is. So we gathered lots of information over months, and maybe it was over a year, did end up receiving a diagnosis of PANDAS, and is currently still undergoing treatment. But I thought their case was, again, just one of those it really highlights in my mind so much more of the idea of the diagnostic overshadowing of not just taking from our care providers, and care providers remembering the reason why you went into the sciences and healthcare was because we like to be curious. That's the whole basis of science and healthcare, is being curious. So of just remembering that when someone's in front of us, and then for families of really being curious of, and again, that knowing your child best, like Helen said, is when you think that something's there, it might not all be down to one thing. We could have some things co-occurring. So I want to then move into discussing red flags for curiosity, which could indicate a treatable condition like PANS or PANDAS, or other experiences going on in this young person's life. So I want to be clear, when I'm using red flags, I'm referring specifically to sudden or concerning changes that, similar to like what Helen was talking about with the 𝘗𝘰𝘵 profile. This is different than using red flags to refer to someone's neurotype, like being autistic or ADHD, as that's not appropriate. So what are some of these red flags to consider for PANS and PANDAS? Again, this could be a sudden or severe onset of OCD behaviors or tics. What's often referred to as regression in skills or development, like in this young person's case with toileting and eating, and engaging in social activities. eating or sleeping difficulties, toileting issues, motor challenges, and sensory dysregulation. These are signs that are important if they appear after an illness or infection, because they could be an indicator of PANS and PANDAS. Because this is also layered and trying to tease everything out is challenging. We put together then some health and behavior templates. Helen was a huge help for me in editing these, making sure we included what we thought should be there. So these were the ones I mentioned in the introduction that are available to you. They will eventually go alongside the webinar, the recording, but are also on my website in the blog, and Helen may end up putting on as well. So the first two, and I want to make sure I say, these are not diagnostic templates. These are just for information gathering when you're trying to just go through the list of like, where do we start? I'm not sure. What should we even be looking for? So again, it's just to gather information. The first two are related to PANS and PANDAS. The first one's for parents and carers, and the second one is for in the educational setting. And the last one is just, I threw it in because why not? I have it, and people use it, so why not? It's to be just looking in general other potential co-occurring healthcare conditions. That tool is particularly there because many conditions like autoimmune issues, allergies, digestive concerns can run in families. So sharing this context with healthcare professionals might make it easier to get the right support. I do want to mention that because it involves family history, that sometimes that can be tricky because of privacy. So use as you are able. All right. I think now that we mentioned school a little bit, that goes back over to Helen and our supports.
Yeah, I'm really aware of the time as well. So,
Yes.
yeah, we've got a few minutes left. So it may be that you need to kind of loop back to this webinar. But we've just made some suggestions that may be helpful for your young person or child. If they're autistic, neurodivergent, or if they have been diagnosed with PANS, PANDAS, or generally if they're just really struggling in their life, this isn't specifically related. This isn't defined to any single category. This is just general things that will support a child who's in distress and really struggling. So things like lowering demands and expectations to prevent that overload that we talked about, to give them more capacity to manage other areas of their life, and reduce those intense spiky profiles to make them a little bit more manageable and more even, where they can be. Focusing on co-regulation as opposed to just being regulated, for example, and modelling that co-regulation with our children. Allowing more time for their natural ways of moving and feeling good, using fidgets, engaging with their special interests, time for stimming, especially if they're autistic, is really important and really regulating and beneficial. And prioritising that meaningful rest and recovery time for them, not maybe our expectations as parents of what we think rest might be good for them. Rest doesn't always mean going for a walk or sitting down and watching TV. That can sometimes be quite stressful for children, depending on where their interests lie. It's their ways of resting and re-regulating, whatever helps them feel good and recharges them. And yeah, that's quite important to consider. And yeah, looking into neuroaffirmative therapies that aren't going to further drain your child's interest and energy is really important to consider, and having that deeper understanding of the overlap of being neurodivergent and PANS, PANDAS, and using things like the trackers that Laura's just mentioned. So we highly recommend looking at PANS PANDAS website, sharing all the fabulous information that they've got on there to share with your GPs and CAMs and school and education staff and wider family and friends as well. You can find more information about autistic burnout on my own website, Autistic Realms. Autism Understood is a great website being created by autistic young people for autistic young people by Spectrum Gaming. So if your young people are experiencing burnout, that might be something to have a look at with them or kind of share with them. And reaching out to actually autistic people and professionals such as Viv Dawes and Jodie Clark, who've done a lot of work around autistic burnout as well. And remember, as parent carers, we need to look after ourselves. I saw it on Joanne's webinar earlier, we can't pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. So yeah, do reach out and get support for yourselves. And for professionals out there, yeah, believe parents and believe young people when they say that they're struggling and that things are changing, and take those concerns seriously. Don't just assume it's because they're autistic or it's because they're neurodivergent and that's just the way it's going to be. You know, if parents are saying something's wrong with their child and it's different, then that needs to be taken seriously.